On a quiet stretch of road, a routine traffic stop quickly escalated into a shocking display of disrespect. A black man, minding his own business, found himself being humiliated by two officers, subjected to harsh words and unwarranted treatment. What the officers didn't know, however, was that the man they were belittling wasn't just any ordinary driver. He was, in fact, the newly appointed state police chief. The irony, they had no idea who he was. As the officers pushed forward with their insensitive behavior, they were oblivious to the power dynamics about to shift right under their noses. What happens next will not only change the course of their careers, but could also raise questions about authority, respect, and the hidden realities that shape law enforcement. Stay tuned to see how this encounter unfolds and what it means for everyone involved. As the officers continued to question the man, their words grew more condescending. They seemed convinced that he was just another driver trying to get away with something. The tension was palpable, with every second feeling like it could escalate further. Meanwhile, the man remained calm, his posture rigid with quiet authority. He wasn't intimidated, but instead, his mind raced, wondering how to handle a situation that was quickly spiraling out of control. He could feel the weight of what was at stake. A few weeks earlier, he had been appointed the new state police chief, a position that should have earned him respect. But here, on the side of the road, his title meant nothing. He had to decide whether to reveal who he was now, or wait until the moment was right. The officers, caught up in their own assumptions, had no clue what was about to unfold. Would they regret their actions, or would it be too late? As the minutes dragged on, the officers' interrogation grew more intense. One of them, Officer Daniels, took the lead, speaking with an air of superiority. "What's in that trunk?" he demanded, his voice sharp. The man, still silent, eyed the officer with growing frustration. Daniels kept pushing, making assumptions about the man's background, even implying he was hiding something. The second officer, Officer Collins, stood by, watching the scene unfold, but offering little resistance. Meanwhile, the man's thoughts began to race. He was deeply aware of the challenges that came with his new role as the state police chief. He had spent years working his way up, earning respect from his peers and community. Yet here he was, reduced to a target for unjust treatment. The weight of systemic bias pressed down on him, and with every taunt, he could feel the years of progress he'd made in law enforcement being undermined. Back at the police station, word of this traffic stop was beginning to spread, but the officers involved had no idea how quickly their lives could change. For them, this was just another routine traffic stop, but for the new police chief, it was a moment that could define his career. As the officers continued to probe, oblivious to the power dynamics, the man felt his patience starting to wear thin. Should he confront them now and reveal who he was? Or would waiting until the right moment allow for a bigger lesson to be learned? The decision weighed heavily on him. With the tension mounting, a thought lingered in the back of his mind. This wasn't just about him, or even about the officers. It was about the larger picture, the subtle racism and lack of respect many people of color faced in this very system. Would he be able to make a difference, or would this moment only fuel more divisions? The tension in the air was thick, the kind that seemed to crackle and pulse with every passing second. The officers, unaware of the storm brewing right under their noses, continued their line of questioning. Daniel's voice grew louder, more forceful. "What's the hurry? Got somewhere to be." He taunted. The man's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. He could feel his heart rate rising, but he fought to keep his composure. He had to be careful. One wrong move, and this could spiral even further. The officers were relentless, making assumptions about everything from his appearance to his vehicle. Officer Collins looked at the man suspiciously, his eyes scanning for any sign of defiance. But the man stayed silent, his mind calculating the next move. He could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier with each passing second. It was no longer just about the stop, it was about the message. He had to teach them, but how? When would be the right moment to strike? From a distance, the flashing lights of another patrol car appeared, the sirens cutting through the night air. A third officer had arrived on the scene, but the tension remained high. The man could sense that this was it, the moment when everything would change. He wasn't just another person being pulled over anymore. He was a symbol. The eyes of the officers flickered from the flashing lights to him, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. Finally, Daniels leaned in close, almost smug in his assumption. "I think we've got enough here," he muttered to Collins. But just as he turned back toward his car to write up the ticket, the man spoke. His voice was calm, almost eerily so, as he slowly rolled down the window. "I think you should know who I am." The officers paused, their faces unreadable. The atmosphere hung in the balance. Time seemed to stretch, and for a moment, no one moved. The man could feel their eyes on him, the weight of the moment building. Was he really going to do this? Reveal his identity now, in this charged atmosphere. His fingers hovered over the door handle, ready to make the next move. But what would it cost him? Would the officers accept the truth, or would they double down? The air seemed to thicken as the question hung there, unanswered. Just as the man was about to reveal who he was, a loud voice from behind interrupted him. "What's going on here?" It was a third officer, but unlike the others, he didn't walk toward the car with any sort of calm professionalism. There was an edge in his tone, a tension that immediately heightened the already volatile situation. The officer, Officer McAllister, strode up to the scene with a firm step, his eyes scanning the man with immediate suspicion. The other two officers, visibly relieved to have backup, exchanged glances, but there was an odd hesitation in their movements. McAllister was known for his aggressive stance when it came to handling situations that didn't fit the book. And the man could already feel that his presence was about to escalate the situation even further. "What's the holdup, Daniels?" McAllister snapped, his voice sharp. "You pulling this guy over for what? He doesn't look like he's causing trouble." Daniels, caught off guard by the sudden shift in authority, tried to explain but stumbled over his words, unsure how to navigate the situation now that McAllister was involved. The man inside the car saw an opportunity, but something didn't sit right. McAllister had no idea who he was either, and the tone of the officer's question seemed almost mocking. Without missing a beat, the new chief decided to take a chance, not just for himself, but for everything that had led him to this moment. "You want to know what's going on? I'll tell you," he said, his voice steady. "I'm the new state police chief." The words landed with a weight none of them could anticipate. The atmosphere shifted, but it wasn't the relief he had hoped for. Instead, a thick, uncomfortable silence stretched across the scene, and McAllister's eyes narrowed. Something in his expression flickered, but it quickly masked itself behind a false smile. "You're what?" he asked, almost too casually, the hint of disbelief hanging in the air. The tension shot up once again, but this time, the man's heart sank. McAllister's reaction was far from what he expected. The officer didn't look like he was about to back down or apologize. He looked like he might double down on his authority, testing how far he could push before consequences came into play. Was McAllister one of the few who resented the idea of someone like him in charge? The man couldn't help but wonder, as the stakes had just been raised higher than he could have imagined. The other officers, still processing the revelation, were too slow to react, and the man knew that this was no longer about a simple power struggle. Something much deeper, much more troubling was brewing. The silence hung in the air, thick and heavy, as McAllister's gaze locked onto the man in the car. For a moment, it felt like everything had stopped. The world, the flashing lights, even the distant hum of traffic seemed to fade into the background. The new police chief was waiting for McAllister's reaction, every fiber of his being on edge. He had hoped for respect, even a little acknowledgement of his authority, but McAllister's response had thrown him off guard. Then, as if shaking off a spell, McAllister's face twisted into something far darker. "I don't care who you are," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're not going to come here and try to play this game with me." The man's heart pounded, but he didn't flinch. This was it. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, though it had come in a way he never expected. McAllister had just confirmed what the man had feared. Some officers might not respect the change he represented. This wasn't about his title. It was about the power struggle, the resentment, the system that had been entrenched for so long. He took a deep breath and slowly stepped out of the car. "Is that so?" he said, his voice calm but firm, his feet planted on the ground. "Because if you're going to take this stance, I think you need to know something else. I'm not just the state police chief. I'm the one who signed your performance review last week. I've been watching everything, and I have your file." For the first time, McAllister's smug expression faltered. His eyes flicked to Daniels and Collins, who were now realizing the gravity of the situation. The officers began to shift uncomfortably, the tension growing thicker as the reality set in. They had underestimated him in every way. But just as it seemed like McAllister would back down, there was another shift. An unexpected figure stepped out from behind the crowd of officers. It was none other than the sheriff, the one person who had backed McAllister's rise to power. He was known for his support of the old guard, the traditionalist values that had dominated the force for years. "I think it's time we had a little chat," the sheriff said, his voice cool and calculating. "But not here, not in front of everyone." The man's blood ran cold. This was a twist he hadn't anticipated. The sheriff wasn't just an ally to McAllister. He was a symbol of the old regime that had held control for so long. The man's fight was far from over. His position as chief was now directly challenged by a much bigger threat than he had realized. This was no longer about a single encounter. It was a battle for the very future of the department. As the sheriff motioned for McAllister to follow him, the man felt the weight of the moment sink in. The fight ahead would be harder, longer, and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The road to reform was littered with obstacles, and the true battle for power had only just begun. The following days were a blur of meetings, reports, and quiet confrontations. The sheriff and McAllister had underestimated the new chief, but they weren't the only ones. Word spread quickly about what had happened on that road, and soon the entire department was talking. The man had expected resistance, but the level of corruption and old-school mentality he had uncovered was staggering. It would take time to rebuild the trust, but this was his fight, one that couldn't be avoided any longer. In the end, McAllister was removed from his position, but the sheriff's influence remained a thorn in his side. Yet the man knew that this was only the beginning. Change in the system would never come easily, but he had earned something far more important: respect. The encounter on that road was a reminder of how far he'd come and how much further he still needed to go. The journey for justice, equality, and true reform had just begun.